Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the SideQuest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of SideQuest.
Good morning, SideQuesters.
Morning.
Good morning, Jonathan.
Welcome back, Zubair.
Good to be back. Always a good time.
Yes, I was excited when we got on the chat, got you in for this book, because I always feel like you have a lot of perspective and education that myself and the audience can glean from, which is cool.
We had Zubair on for The Exorcist. I wish we had him on for A Head Full of Ghosts, because I think we could have had more evidence to stack against Tremblay's lack of research.
Well, thank you for sparing me from reading that book, from what I understand.
Yeah, you're welcome. But we wanted to have you on for this. We wanted to have Zubair share his insights for this book because of its religious overtones, which, given the conversation we had just before we hit record, are a lot more obvious on a second or third read-through, and Zubair picked it up on his first read-through. I want to get into that, but that's for the meatier part of the episode. Right now, I'm going to give us a plot overview, and then we should get into it.
That sounds good, Slava. All right, adventurers, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a side quest.
So the book opens with Mary Kate, who's an average woman working as a waitress in a diner, married to a former English major who now drives a taxi. One night, she's attacked in New York City in an alley by a man who is far from ordinary. The assault leaves her pregnant, and she and her husband name their son Jeffrey. However, a strange force begins to tear their family apart, causing them to turn against each other. Eventually consumed by hatred for her husband, Mary Kate kills him and is sent to prison, while little Jeffrey is sent to an orphanage. There he takes on the name Baal and begins to exhibit sinister powers that grow stronger as he gets older. And he insists on being called Baal, a name of an ancient demon. When Baal becomes an adult, his evil threatens the entire world. And we have Professor Verga, who sets out to find his friend, who went to write a book about Baal. And we are introduced to a new character towards the end of the book named Michael. And Michael and Verga set out to stop Baal and his followers.
Quick and easy summary, Slava. Appreciate that reminder. Now, let's talk to our guest over here, Zubair. Your first time reading this, is that right?
It is indeed.
Yep. Yeah, so you and I were on the same footing here. The folks have heard for the last couple episodes my thoughts. Oh, look at that. For the audience, Zubair is hugging his little Baal book. You know, like the...
And I've actually got a question for you guys. How did you find this book?
I blame Slava.
When I had to get one to be on this show, I couldn't find a new copy, and I paid a good amount of money on Amazon to buy this very beat-up copy. The creases on the spine of the book were there for a long time, is what it looks like, but I had to pay something like $15, $20 for a very beat-up copy. Didn't get it, so it's clearly out of print, but how did you guys find this?
Send the receipt to Slava. He'll pay you back.
So I constantly do research on books, and I just Googled famous horror books of the 70s. I'm like, let's go old. I did a few Google searches. Robert MacCammon's name kept coming up, and he, I think, got overshadowed by King, because King was king in the 70s and 80s, but Robert MacCammon wasn't too far behind. Baal was a book that popped up on a different search when I was searching Robert MacCammon, and I read the publisher's summary of it. I'm like, ooh, this is interesting. This would be something cool to cover. And an extra parenthetical note for this, Jonathan and I always want to do something interesting for the audience. One of the things we're planning out for maybe next year is covering books that have become popular movies. Like Jurassic Park, for example. Everybody's watched Jurassic Park. A lot of people have read the book Jurassic Park. But it's interesting to talk about how this popular fiction, has become into blockbuster movies and how different it is. Is there something inherent in books like Jurassic Park that make them good stories and make them appealing to people like Spielberg or whoever got it in front of Spielberg? All that to say is, through my research of older horror books, I came upon the name Robert MacCammon, read his first book, thought it was really good, got on the calendar, our production calendar, and here we are.
Thank you. If you actually want to do a podcast on one book that is very, very different from the movie, I would recommend Forrest Gump.
Oh,
The book's really different?
Oh, yeah. He's not so sweet in the book.
Oh, boy. Uh-oh.
ooh.
Uh-oh. All right, I'll put it on the list.
Interest peaked automatically.
Yeah, I'm curious now. Okay. Noted. But Zubair, throw me some of your initial thoughts reading this book first time.
Well, as you've discussed before, I completely agree that it has very good pacing. And the story, the premise is compelling enough that there's no point where it's just like, I don't like this book. I'm only reading it because I had to talk about it on a podcast. I actually wanted to turn the page and know what happens. So Robert MacCammon did a very good job there. I did catch on like fairly early that, well, not just that title is named after a demon named in the Bible, but also the parents are the ones that are tasked with raising the Antichrist early on, whereas Mary Kate and Joe. So kind of a take on Mary and Joseph. After Michael was introduced, I was wondering if there's like some kind of a link between this mysterious figure named Michael and the archangel Saint Michael. And sure enough, there was. The influence of Christianity on the book did definitely leave an impression on me. That might be a turnoff for many people, but that's actually something that has a good amount of appeal for me. Being Christian without being blatantly Christian, which make it so, and just kind of seeing the influence that religion has, which is kind of underestimated, not just in stories, but in all aspects of life. But I enjoyed the book overall. That Baal would blame, like kind of arouse the hatred of Jews while he was in Kuwait, kind of left an impression on me. I'm Catholic now, but I was raised Muslim, and we talked about that previously, last time I was on this side quest. And this was kind of something that is very standardized throughout much of the Muslim, is just kind of blaming of Jews for every little thing. I stubbed my toe, it was the Jews.
How dare they put a couch in my way?
That's what they're known for, stubbing toes.
Yep. In fact, I stubbed my toe this morning. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, that couch at that place you're staying, that was mine. I did that. Haha.
Jews put a couch in my way.
Yeah.
But overall, I liked it. There were some kind of things that were weird, like at the end, the climactic battle happening between Baal and Michael. Michael's given an explanation of what's going on, and I think it's like that kind of departs from standard Christian theology and is kind of like Robert MacCammon's own thoughts. And it seems like a very dualistic world where it's the devil and God are equals in power and forever at war with each other. We know in Christian theology that's not the case at all. The devil is nowhere close to having the power of God. And the jump from, which is also spoken about in previous episode, the jump from Kuwait to Antarctica was a little bit odd.
It threw me off so much. I was like, what?
Reading it, I was thinking of like just visualizing that map in Indiana Jones, where it's like the red dots go from Kuwait up to Antarctica. Overall, I enjoyed the novel quite a bit, and I would recommend that someone give it a read.
One thing I want to comment on is the religious aspects of the book that you brought up, Zubair. It seems, and we don't know what's inside McCammon's head or his worldview. I haven't been able to find anything in my research on that, but the Christian elements are there, even though they're sprinkled through there, and they're a little bit toned down, so it's not overtly a Christian book, like you said. But one thing that stood out to me is, as you were talking, Mary, Kate, and Joseph being the parents of the Antichrist, essentially, and Revelation is quoted in reference to the Antichrist. Throughout the book, there's little, like, vignettes or whatever you want to call them, little sidebars the fact that they're called Mary, Kate, and Joseph, I don't think that was by mistake. I think McCammon wanted to make some sort of statement, not necessarily a religious or political one. Maybe it's not even a statement. I think that was intentional just for the sake of the story. It's interesting to me because there are and were myths about Jesus lies spread about Jesus, that he's actually a son of a Roman soldier named Panthera, if I'm not mistaken, that Mary was raped and the whole nativity story was concocted in order to cover up the rape. I don't know how much research Robert MacCammon could have done while working at a convenience store or a clothing store, department store, as he was writing this. If he had any exposure to religion, I would imagine it would have probably been Catholicism, and maybe in those exposures he had some type of exposure to this myth, maybe some sort of apologetics course or whatever. This could have been found anywhere. But it's interesting that he did that. He has Michael, the archangel, on the other end of it, and two professors who are somewhat religious, but they're not overtly religious. And even Virga, he makes these allusions to scripture that kind of gives the impression that he is a religious man, but there's never large swaths of dialogue or anything that is defensive of Christianity or showing good versus evil in any explicit way. But this is also his first book. His first published book. He wrote it part-time. I don't know what went into the research behind it. He also said he wanted to write about something that he doesn't know. I guess what I'm saying is it turned out really well. The fact that so much of the Christian religious elements came into it, to me, is fascinating. I want to know more about what prompted him to insert these specific things.
I was really impressed by his commenting, like, people say write what you know. I wanted to write about stuff I didn't know, because I've tried to write about, I don't know if, Zubair's a writer as well. Slava's done some writing. You ever tried to write about something you don't know about? It's super difficult. It just seems like this was so easy for him. Maybe he did 300 drafts. I don't know. But, it seems like it flows real well here.
Well, who the hell's going to go to Greenland and confirm?
Touché.
With McCammon, so it's like, can't really find any public statements about his own religious convictions. But McCammon does sound like an Irish name, even if he wasn't religious necessarily. Like, if he would step into a church, there's a good chance it would be a Catholic church, in which case we'll find figures that do have a special prominence in Catholicism. If you go inside a Catholic church, there's a good chance that to the left of the altar, when you're facing it, is going to be a statue of the Virgin Mary, and to the right is going to be a statue of Joseph. Even if he's not religious, he may very well have been exposed to a prayer like the St. Michael, the Archangel prayer. Even if Christianity and religion is something he wrote about which he didn't know about, he may have had some exposure which kind of just prompted him to, by instinct, latch on to these figures.
That was my assumption as well. With his last name, if he had any exposure to Christianity, it would have been Catholicism. I think that's a safe assumption. We talked about briefly before we started recording about characters who are supposed to be Christian, but it's a critique of Christianity, but they're done so poor. Are you sure this character is supposed to be a Christian? It seems like this is one-dimensional caricature. That is kind of the underlying principle. There are people like that who have very little understanding of their own religion, and McCammon could be one of those. But like you said, Zubair, things stay with you. When you're exposed to these things as a child, even if you end up rejecting whatever it is, Catholicism in this case, you will have these things imprinted on you. It's inescapable. Those things could have come out as he was writing it.
Indeed.
When did you realize, Zubair, that the main characters, Mary Kate and Joseph, or Joe, whatever, were like, oh, this is pretty clear? Because you mentioned that to me this morning, and I was like, oh, okay, this seems really obvious, but I missed it.
I noticed it pretty early on, clear from the beginning, that whatever entity raped Mary Kate, it was probably not human. It was a supernatural.
Yeah.
And then this child was born to Mary Kate and Joe. I guess at some point trying to figure out, is this going to be an Antichrist figure? Because it's clearly going in that direction. And then, his mother and foster father are named Mary and Joseph. It might just be a Catholic instinct where it's like if you see a reference to the Holy Family, then all of a sudden you notice it very quickly because you're exposed.
Sure, that's fair. Yeah.
Left and right.
Yeah, that's fair. Zubair, have you ever, and maybe this isn't a great question, but we're talking about the supernatural. Have you ever had supernatural moments?
Yes. There have been moments where it's like it's difficult to explain what happened outside of something supernatural. There was one time I was actually at a church. This was shortly after I'd become Catholic. I went to the Church of St. Francis, which is about a block east of Madison Square Garden in Midtown Manhattan. And it was while praying. This was in the lower church. There was a church upstairs and a church downstairs. I was in the downstairs one, and it was supposed to be a quiet time. But I kept hearing like this spitting sound. Kind of like, well, someone's trying to cough something up and then spit it out. And it was very odd. And I was kind of like wondering, like, am I in the vicinity of like an exorcism going on?
Oh.
And then at some point I heard this very, very deep growl that the human vocal range cannot naturally make. I remember there's like some nurses that were in that lower church, and they kind of like looked at each other and went right upstairs, I guess trying to see if they could help or anything. Like, I didn't witness with my eyes, but I heard what I heard. And it was just one of these things where it's like, I don't know any other explanation for that sound.
Yeah.
Very well may have been in the vicinity of like a topic that I'd only previously seen in a film.
Yeah. Wow.
The best explanation I knew of was being within the vicinity of something supernatural, kind of being clubbed in the back of the head with a reality, and the reality being that there's much more going on than what the eyes can see.
I like that saying, clubbed in the head with reality in a moment like that. It's a good sentence.
What I find fascinating, Zubair, as you were talking, you were clubbed in the head with the reality or the realization that there's something out there beyond what we can sense with our natural senses. And I think that's only possible to have that realization if your worldview allows for the supernatural. Because a materialist will be like, well, obviously you're having a psychotic episode, or you're misinterpreting the squeaking of the wall, or an animal dying in between the rafters for something demonic. But to me, this kind of stuff points out what I will die on a hill for. It is your worldview, your presuppositions that determine how you view the world. The world is the world. We all have access to the same data. Geometry existed when Abraham walked the earth. And so as we discover new things and explore the world, we get a greater sense of understanding of really how much knowledge there is out there. But only in a supernatural worldview, a Christian worldview, I would argue, can you make sense of all that. Even in something that was, I would say, was mysterious. You didn't know exactly what the hell happened in the situation you just described. But only with a supernatural worldview can you say, yes, math exists and science exists, and all the things that a materialist would use against you in a debate, because no, I agree with you. All those things exist and science is great, but only within your worldview can you interpret what you experienced correctly.
I mean, what happens, whether we're willing to believe it, whether we have a worldview that will allow us to be willing to believe it. And if the supernatural is indeed real, then you have to have a worldview that allows for the supernatural to, yes, correctly see that what happens is happening.
So on this topic of supernatural, and then to Slava's point about geometry existed when Abraham walked around, I think about this sometimes, and how although science has advanced compared to, let's say, the 50s, which is great, a lot of more lives are being saved, that's awesome, but we haven't discovered everything. I was thinking about this recently, specifically when there was a plane door that flew off mid-flight, and then people started disappearing after they started talking about it. So, names of planes will be redacted. But
For the safety of the podcast
for the
host.
safety of the yeah. But I was thinking about this, like, flight's only been around for 100 years. Like the Orwell brothers, Wilbur and
Right. The Wright brothers.
yeah, I get them mixed up. Or not the Orwell, the
Wright brothers.
Thank you. Yeah. Wow.
1919.
Yeah, 1919. 100 years. You guys, planes have only existed for 100.
I think it was 1903.
Whatever, early 1900, but 100 years, right? Like, we just passed 100 years recently. That's it. That's how long flight's been around, and like we have advanced really quickly. But the laws of aerodynamics existed the whole time, and so like when we have these moments where reality strikes, it's not necessarily supernatural, but then you have to juxtapose that. At least this is how my mind thinks. Like you can have something that you can reprove, through the scientific method. It's like, okay, this is just a physical law or a natural law. And then you have moments like Zubair's talking about, or Slava and I have had conversations about supernatural experiences, and it's like, you know that something just happened, and it's either inexplainable or like you also had, for lack of words, like an aura or a presence or something that you felt in a space, and you were like, oh wow, because there's been a couple exorcisms that I've been a part of that were less Hollywood and more tame, if you will, but like spiritual beings existed in these two specific like territorial house spaces, like one at a buddy's house and another at a nightclub where a bride killed herself just before the wedding. Some friends called me up at these two different instances and asked me to come and sort it out. I was apparently the only person they knew. It's not a very, well, there are actually a bunch of Catholics here, but apparently they didn't know any of them. Nor would I think an average Catholic, and Zubair, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, like an average Catholic wouldn't necessarily go in and do like a short-term exorcism themselves, probably, right?
No, not the average.
Yeah, okay. But anyway, some physical thing changed after you did a spiritual action, or a spiritual action happened to you as a being, as a natural being, and then you have to rationalize. So I think my conclusive thought here is, which is kind of an ending thought, not necessarily something to tap onto, is it baffles me that people don't have more consideration of philosophy and like questioning of the real world when you have, and this is why I love what you said, you get hit on the head with like a spiritual moment and you're like, oh right, the spirit realm exists, because we so quickly forget, and it's more real than reality.
I think what kills the conversation or distorts the conversation is pop theology, where both Christians and non-Christians views the supernatural is something akin to what they show in the movies, or it's fat cherubs strumming hearts on clouds.
Or magic,
or it's anything that feels a little bit off kilter or out of the ordinary, which could be chalked up to just a coincidence or a bad headache or maybe even some sort of psychosis that you're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
The supernatural, what we're saying is there are things that are immaterial in this world. There's more than just what we see. And if you have things that are immaterial like logic and math and the laws of physics, if those things exist, it is not a large leap to say that there is something beyond this material veil that's not just concepts and abstract thoughts that are nothing more than our synapses firing in our brains or something. And I think when people popularize supernaturalism, let's call it that, that's where you get stupid things being said by Christians that gives fodder to the non-Christians. Go, well, see, none of that exists. And yeah, probably none of that exists. I would say 100% none of that exists. But there is something beyond the veil that we don't know or can't see. And not every time somebody says, I think I saw a demon, that they really saw a demon.
Right.
But there are events in people's lives all over the world all the time that can be explained by natural science. It doesn't mean that in 1,000 years, the natural sciences will have a natural materialistic explanation for this thing. I think that's too shallow a worldview. But I digress.
Yeah.
My latest article that was published by the National Catholic Register a couple of weeks ago, did you hear about the case made the news about a year ago about Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster?
No.
No.
So a year ago, the body of a nun who had founded actually this order of nuns, but she was buried in Missouri. She'd been dead since 2019, and her body was exhumed. She was going to be placed elsewhere, and it was discovered that even though she had not been embalmed, her body was still preserved as if she had just freshly died. So there's no evidence of her corruption, and that made the news because then all of a sudden this might be a case of what is called incorruptibility, which is a phenomenon which is seen as kind of like a sign of sainthood in the Catholic Church. And so a lot of people began kind of just taking pilgrimages to this church in Missouri to see the body of Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster. Now, it's not a confirmed miracle by the Catholic Church. The Church doesn't just take the word of any Joe Schmo who says, I saw a miracle. They actually have a way to investigate what happens. If you are curious about miraculous phenomenon, the ones that are actually recognized by the Catholic Church have undergone a good amount of investigation. With the science we have, you can go put it through far more rigorous investigation than you could in previous days. If you actually are willing to believe in miracles and you would be reluctant to believe anyone who just claims to have seen a miracle without having any way to verify, what the church recognizes is actually a good place to look. And then you'll see all kinds of things where it's like whenever the host, the bread, which is considered the Eucharist, whenever it bleeds, it actually has the same blood type each time. That's AB. If you were to splash some fake blood on a host and then try to submit that as evidence, unless it's AB and of Semitic origin, they'll rule it out right away because it's happened. It's rare that it happens, but it has happened enough times that they know what to look for and what Christ's body blood type was. The Marian apparition sites, those are very, very interesting, and kind of a fascination with those helped bring me into the Catholic Church. But these phenomena, they're very, very rare. I can't blame someone who is reluctant to believe the words of that Joe Schmo who says he saw a miracle, because how do we know that that guy's not just some fraud? But these things do exist, and the ones that have been verified are very fascinating.
So, on that thought, do you feel like the evidence of the priest in Baal here, like, did his due diligence? Or are these rules that have come up in the last 40 years, roughly, where that wouldn't have existed in a time where McCammon wrote this book? Or maybe he just wasn't aware of them, which is also possible.
What are you referring to? The evidence of the...
In Baal, where they, like, look at, not necessarily like miracles, but like things happening, supernatural things happening, where they, like, whether it's an exorcism or a miracle or whatever other categories that Catholics adhere to, where they do this rigorous, like, hey, was it just like the sun glinting off a thing that made a whatever, to try to make up an example on the spot here. Like, do you think that, and maybe this is just a poorly worded question, that the Catholic priest in Baal did his due diligence in determining whether or not Baal was an actual supernatural being? This question is not good. Ignore me. Someone take it over.
All right.
Well, I think we can end this and jump to a question I want to ask Zubair.
Go for it.
Why didn't you like the book? But I want to end it with just two notes. I think the very denial of the possibility of a supernatural is not a piece of evidence. It's simply a manifestation of the rejection, right? Like, almost all of our experiences, things happen in regular patterns. And they are discernible and observable by natural law. But there is nothing in our human experience that should persuade us that irregularity in those patterns is impossible, or everything that always behaves naturally and regularly. We have not seen everything. Let me get back. We have not seen what everything always does, because we haven't seen everything, and we can't always see everything. So a complete denial of the supernatural just proves my point. You start with a worldview with the premise that supernaturalism, miracles, those are illogical and irrational. And with that starting premise, the non-believer observes the world. That's where I think the problem is. But theological rant over. Is there stuff that you didn't like about the book, Zubair?
I would agree with the those who have spoken about it previously in side quests, where like the jump from Kuwait to Greenland and onward to the North Pole, that was a little bit weird,
It's so wacky.
especially with Verga, where he's like trying to find his missing friend, but it doesn't really explain like why finding his missing friend is so important. Kind of seems that he's like it's just because he's an altruistic guy. And the thing is, trying to make someone a character one-dimensionally good, and he was not quite one-dimensional, but he's more to that. But if you just kind of like unexplainably make him the good guy, he's one-dimensionally good in that sense. It's just kind of leads to characters that are somewhat shallow. And this was Robert MacCammon's first book, so like, character development is something he may have like worked on and improved upon in his later books, but the characters were just okay. And then the gigantic theological rant at the very end, I think it was kind of an excuse for when Michael was talking about how God and the devil are forever locked in warfare. And it's described as if like it's a very dualistic sense in that they are equals rather than God being far more powerful. Robert MacCammon may have made the mistake of just finding some excuse to write down his own thoughts. And his own thoughts were not necessarily what's true, but what sounded cool in his head. So the ending was kind of unsatisfactory, I would say. But overall, the book was good.
Sometimes an author has an agenda. An agenda not in the negative sense, just an agenda. But it goes back to the exposure conversation where he was exposed to certain things. So I think, now I'm putting myself in McCammon's head when he's 25, not only will this be cool, to your point, Zubair, but this is what I know. And then I make certain extrapolations based on the little I know. And therefore, not only does it sound cool, but this is actually what maybe a professor or maybe St. Michael would say. This is what would be normal for somebody who's a theology professor at a Catholic university to say when he meets the Antichrist.
I do want to get into the meat of the episode, and before we had Zubair on, we asked him to do some looking and digging into Baal, the history of Baal, the idolatry, the demonology, the human desire to worship. So, Zubair, why don't you kick us off with some of this research that you did? Because I know that I'm super interested, and I think that the audience will get at minimum, some more information for trivia night they go to on their weekly outings.
Sounds good. So, in ancient Semitic languages, the word Baal means the lord or the owner. The equivalent would be saying like, I'm the lord of the estates, of these estates. It would be like saying, I'm the Baal of these estates. But in ancient Canaan, the word Baal, lord, eventually became synonymous with the god of fertility and rain. Like Zeus, Baal was considered to be a storm god. And then Baal, or Bel, as the Babylonians would have pronounced it, may have eventually been the influence that developed the Greek understanding of the god Zeus. We don't know, but storm gods seem to be the top of the pantheon. Is not something we can just dismiss right away as coincidence. So Baal himself, which most scholars would agree, was probably the title given by the Canaanites to the Mesopotamian god, Hadad, who was the storm god in that particular pantheon. Storm gods are very important because the importance of rain rather than irrigation made the weather gods especially crucial in the pantheon because the people, they were anxious for rain. They needed rain to live. If you didn't have rain, you didn't have farming. These are economies that are very, very dependent on agriculture. You can't really predict the rain, but what you can do is appeal to whatever power makes the rain fall so that you'll have your crops and you'll be able to live. Adequate rain meant survival. I guess the worshipping of the god of rain was a necessity for the people here. We don't know a whole lot about Baal's function or personality. What we do know, the little bit we do know, comes from tablets that were uncovered in northern Syria at the ancient port city of, I think it's Ugarit. Good chance I'm butchering the pronunciation of it. But there's some tablets that were found in 1929. We know rather little about a pantheon that hasn't been used for a very long time. So it's believed that Baal was a kind of like an everlasting combat with Mot, who is the god of sterility and death in the mythology of Canaan. And if Baal were to win this combat, a 7-year cycle of fertility and rain would ensue. Whereas if he lost, there would be 7 years of drought and famine.
Interesting.
So yeah, the 7 and 7. The thing that when I came upon this fact, this first thing I thought about was Genesis. Joseph, son of Jacob. His brothers did some things. He ended up making his way to Egypt, and then he was asked while he was in prison to interpret the dream of Pharaoh, in which there's the 7 fat cows, the 7 skinny cows. Seems like the 7 and 7 is kind of coincides with the beliefs about Baal and Mot being in everlasting combat. I don't know what the relationship is between that mythology and what we read about in Genesis, but it's something definitely to look at and study.
Yeah.
So just like any culture very dependent on agriculture, became the chief god precisely because he was the god of rain. And he was seen to have seized this divine kingship from Yam, which is the sea god, and his consort and sister was Anath. She was the goddess of love and war. So the cult of Baal kind of grew, and it spread throughout the Mediterranean region with the Phoenician colonization during the first millennium BC. Most of these colonies were historically, we can say, insignificant, but some of them grew and thrived. Most notably, one of them was Carthage. So the name became anathema to Israel, probably in roughly the 9th century BC. And that was when Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, had a program to introduce the cult of Baal to Israel. And this is recorded in 2 Kings. And for those who are familiar with the biblical kings of Israel, Ahab was considered far and away one of the worst, probably the worst. The prophet Elijah had a fair amount of criticism directed toward Ahab. Baal Hamam, who was likewise the god of fertility and vegetation, became the chief god in the Carthaginian pantheon. Now, there's a great chapter in G.K. Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, which actually talks about the Punic Wars and the difference between the Roman and the Carthaginian pantheon. So we know very little about the cult of Baal coming from Canaan, but we do know quite a lot more about the worship of gods in Carthage, and it was not pretty at all. A great amount of human sacrifice was being done to appeal and appease their Baal. Chesterton's take on it was that it was a very, very good thing that the Romans had won the Punic Wars, and not just won, but completely just destroyed Carthage, made sure that culture is never coming back. Because if Carthage would have won and would have gone on to dominate the Mediterranean by the time of Christ, the world would have been very, very different in a much darker way. Though we don't know much about the cult of Baal in Canaan, we do know from Carthage, which was a Phoenician colony, that there's a pretty good chance that the cult of Baal had become so synonymous with evil. The word Baal became synonymous with the Israelites, synonymous to the demonic, because if the cult of Baal may very well have been behaving in the way the cult of Baal did in Carthage. It's what are you willing to sacrifice your child for? That remains a question that is particularly relevant to the question of abortion today. It's, the language that's used around that topic is religiously neutered if you're trying to argue in favor of abortion. But the thing is, just because religious language is neutered doesn't necessarily mean that religion is absent.
Right.
We go around it. And the fact is, we all worship something, whether we call ourselves religious or not. And what are you willing to sacrifice your child for is a valid question.
Baal worship, from my research and studies in seminary, did include human sacrifice, but specifically child sacrifice. And we see Naughton, while engrossed in a violent orgy, kills a small child. Now, it's not a baby. The kid was probably 10 years old in the book, if I remember correctly, but he sacrifices him during an orgy. And my studies, specifically with an ancient Near East professor, revealed that Baal worship in Canaan also included child worship and orgies because of the fertility aspect of Baal. The agricultural fertility and the cult rites of that day dictated, in order to have Baal win this battle, whether it was symbolic or not, is relevant, but in order to bring about rains, in order for Baal to bless his worshipers, I'm not sure if I'm going to do it any justice, but if I remember correctly, some of the worshipers of Baal believed that even rain was, quote unquote, semen of God, that it fertilized the land, and therefore, by them having sexual congress, participating in this orgies, that would bring about rain in the real realm, so to speak. So it's interesting to pull all these things out, because for not knowing a lot about what he's writing, McCammon was exposed to something.
Yeah, it feels like he did have at least some sort of education, maybe Sunday school for 5 or 6 years, but like, I would be impressed and surprised if he wrote all this without having some research.
I mean, yeah, the name Baal is mentioned in Second Kings. I guess the word itself, even though its ancient meaning is just lord or owner, became such seen as so repulsive to the Israelites that they kind of picked it up as a word synonymous with the demonic. Remember, in the New Testament, the devil's often referred to as Beelzebub, like when Christ was exorcising devils. Some of the priests of the Sanhedrin accused him of doing it by Beelzebub, which means Lord of the Flies. So to have the word Beel, which is offshoot of Baal, became like just synonymous with the demonic. I mean, McCammon, he didn't just pick the word Baal out of his butt. This comes mentioned in Second Kings, and like the cult of Baal had like an enormous amount of influence during the time of King Ahab, and that's when the prophet Elijah was living, and pretty much he's preaching in what initially looks like a very much losing battle against far more priests of this cult of Baal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is what I know about Baal.
Well, from that,
I didn't know that they believed that he was a god coming on the coming on them for rain.
Yeah.
there's more to it than just that, the professor explained. And it wasn't that every single Baal worshiper or every single cult of Baal believed exactly that. I remember him stating that specifically, although all Baal worshippers were involved in some really gruesome things, certain factions of Baal cults did believe that specific thing. Now, I'm going to emphasize that I'm probably not doing enough justice because this was about 10 years ago, and I did a very little dive back into Baal and the cult of Baal. I kind of left that to you, Zubair, because we wanted your perspective on it and we wanted you to add this element to the podcast. But there were people back in the ancient Near East who worshipped Baal who did believe that, I don't know if they would have actually explained it this way, but the way that my professor understood it, or the people in his camp understood it, as these particular people did view rain as God coming on the earth to fertilize the soil, to fertilize their crops. And sometimes, the rites included child sacrifice. And that was part of other demons, gods that Israel was opposed to, or the prophets of Israel as opposed to, that also included child sacrifice. And that's probably for another podcast and another conversation. But it's interesting to see the connections of those ancient Near East pantheons, how orgies and child sacrifice, specifically with Baal, how that's all intertwined.
So before Baal became a known entity, and it was just like this word, like, oh, hey, he's a landlord, right? Like, because that's what I heard. That's the equivalent here.
Right,
Back in the day.
Right, because Baal, to Zubair's point, means Lord. So I think the word is used in the Old Testament, not referencing Baal, but is used as just a title of people too. Lord.
The word Gideon had some title, I think, with the word Baal in it. Prior to the events of Second Kings, I think his time would have been. So it's an old Semitic word that eventually just became a bad word.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Gideon earned the title Jerubbaal after he destroyed his family's altar of Baal. You're right.
Yeah, and Gideon by itself means one who cuts down, or warrior. It's supposed to show images of strength and ferocity.
So anyway, I wanted to get to, I was like building up to something. So this word, Baal, right? It's a regular word in ancient Samaria, and then slowly it gains power over a territory, and then grows, and then we move into King Ahab, and like it becomes a cult. We all function under the meta ethic that a spirit realm exists, there's good and evil, and there are spirits in general. And I don't have a strong question here, but I'm just like verbally theorizing. What do you think it's like for an entity, a spirit entity, to go, you know what, I'm going to take over that word, and then starts doing things in the natural to build that up to the point where people groups start to say, okay, Baal is the fertile god. We need to do X, Y, or Z rites to bring about fertilization of the land. And then this is another side thought that I was thinking about when you were talking to Zubair, is there's a lot of pattern across all cultures and peoples and times that involve blood, sacrifice, and the rites to provoke the spirit realm to interact with the physical realm. That pattern seems pretty apparent across space and time, across all belief systems, from witchcraft to ancient Samaria to Christianity and so on, Judaism too. It's thought-provoking to me that doesn't do something, right? Like there's evidence. Even if you're an atheist, it's like if you were to look across non-Christian cultures and see these patterns, and then the results of said patterns and rites and activities, something occurs when that happens, which makes me go, well, then it's undeniable that there is something behind what we call the veil.
Outside of religion, like it's known that, like, if you want to become a doctor, you have to sacrifice a lot of time doing that studying. To get a good result, there has to be a sacrifice. You can't just sit around getting drunk all the time or just watching TV all the time, never lift a finger, and expect a good result. That's just something universal, is the idea of sacrifice, or the understanding that sacrifice will bring about a positive result, a desirable result. I actually thought about, thinking about child sacrifice and Genesis, to think about, like, Abraham. And his understanding was that God had asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he was told last minute, no, do not do that. But I was wondering, was it really God that had told him to sacrifice Isaac? Or was it his understanding, based on everything that was around him?
Oh, interesting.
This is what a God expects. And it might be like, okay, that moment may have been like an event which was a switch for him in many ways. But it might have been that realization that, like, oh, what everyone else expects their gods within their cult to do is actually not the case with the true God.
That's some deep insight right there. I haven't thought about that context, but this is why context is important, where it's like what's going on in, ancient Canaan and what is Abraham raised with that would set his context to go, okay, this is just normal. Good insight, Zubair. I want to get back to this thing, though, that I brought up where it's like, I think that you or me or anyone can take something that's mundane today and give it power and let it become what I would call a stronghold in your life that then becomes a god of sorts, a Baal, right? And this is going to be a real side quest rabbit trail here. But like, you can take something like, you have trouble sleeping 2 nights in a row. Oh my God, I probably have insomnia. And now you've taken this thing that exists, self-diagnosed it, and started feeding it energy and power. And then like, it's really because you had coffee at 7 p.m. because you were studying for a test. But you chalk it up to like, stressed, I'm like, can't sleep now. And like, you don't think about, to your point, Zubair, and like Catholicism, where you're like, let me try and rule out the things that could be the possibility of why this is happening first. But instead, you just start giving power to this thing. Have you guys ever seen this or experienced this, but in your own life or otherwise, and seen it in other people where they start, like, you knew them before a moment, and then after a time period, like now something really bothers them that you're like, I wasn't there before, but it wasn't necessarily a traumatic event.
I mean, something like a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Sure, you can call it that.
I don't think that's uncommon at all. The mind definitely plays tricks on us. It can start interpreting things that aren't really quite the case in a certain light because you convinced yourself that this is the way it is. We're probably doing it right now in so many ways without realizing it.
Say the question again.
Have you, in your life or in the lives of people around you, seen them for a time period and then after a time period where they've given power to something that was previously mundane? And I'm equating this back to Zubair's history lesson for us real quick about Baal just being like, oh, you're just like a landlord. You're just like a lord of a thing, a territory, a place, a people group, whatever. And then it became like, well, Baal is a god now and part of the pantheon.
No, not necessarily. I think cultures create concepts. Ancient Near Eastern cultures didn't have the same scientific understanding of water versus semen, but they saw what they thought were similarities. Semen brings about life. Water brings about life. Everybody worships something. So around those cults, around those ideas, cultures built a theology. God is male, earth is female. That's a concept that's not something that came up in the last 100 years. That's been around for thousands of years. Rain then became viewed as the quote-unquote semen of heaven, and that became entrenched. I think there are certain ideas within cultures from today to 3,000 years ago that become entrenched, and then those concepts evolve, and people begin to discuss them and attribute definitions to certain things and attribute consequences and causes to certain things. And out of that, all this is built. So I don't think that people give power to certain things.
But that's what it sounds like you just described.
Maybe somebody would say it's semantics.
Sorry to interrupt, but like proposing that like this people group, they saw semen create life, they saw rain create life, and they started to equate these things, but then they gave energy and time and like emotion, to just use some words, to this thought, and then started going, oh, okay. And they started doing things toward that thought. And then to me, this is how I see it based on, my micro history lesson here is they started giving this thing power and it started to grow. And this is a book about power. And so I'm like, this is why it seems relevant to me, both in the micro history lesson and otherwise.
Yeah, that makes sense. But this is not just a Baal thing or an ancient Near East thing. Papua New Guinea, African tribes, some of them were around during this time. But even as early as in the last few hundred years, scholars and archaeologists have also found that Papua New Guinea and a lot of African tribes, certain older Egyptian tribes, people groups, they did also equate water, river, rain, and semen. Those to them were almost interchangeable because of what they believed, those concepts that I mentioned just a little bit ago. So I think the power there comes to them attributing, in their theological discussions, attributing certain power to these things. and in the need to worship something, because that's inescapable for humans, the cult of demons like Baal became widespread. So it might be semantics to you and maybe to some of the listeners, but that's how I would answer it, because I think we had to be more precise.
I'm going to make a quick rebuttal, and then we can start closing down this enterprise for this episode. My rebuttal would be, I was rereading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl this week, which is just a fantastic book about giving great perspective on like creating meaning in your life. And in the second half of the book, he addresses logotherapy, which is a type of therapy that he ended up developing. He speaks about these people who have a neuroses where they didn't have a neuroses before, but because they started giving it attention, he doesn't use the word power, but because they started giving it attention, it had a grasp on them that they couldn't overcome. And so logotherapy was used to help them overcome it and recategorize it in their mind with a narrative to drain it of power, using my words, not his. So from someone who's done psychological things, at least, and this is, very directly veering off from ancient people groups, but I think it feeds into the question and point that I was trying to propose, where it's like, we as humans get to give things power because we have the capability of doing that. It doesn't mean that those things are good. To me, it's more of a sobering warning that we should be aware of what we're giving time and attention to, because things can start to own us in ways that they aren't actually supposed to own us.
That goes back to Jesus' teachings, the Bible's teachings as a whole. What master are you serving?
Sure, worship.
That could be something that Frankl talked about. You're not necessarily worshiping your trauma, but it's something that holds a grasp of your psyche, of your being. And that could also work in other situations where the worship of Baal. Who's your master? What have you let master your life? Whether it's an event, whether it's some sort of substance, a thought, an idea, a theological idea, a demon, Jesus, all those things that you give yourself over to end up being the Lord of your life.
Zubair, any final thoughts here on this very light topic?
Well put, Slava. Yeah, I guess like researching the word Baal and just kind of like seeing the development of it gives a better idea of like, okay, this cult of Baal is something that came from somewhere. You can't really just dismiss. It's not fair to just dismiss these ancients as being such stupid people,
right?
Because they had within themselves what I have within myself. And they did it because they were capable of developing this cult, but that I likewise have their exact same flaws. And it's not fair to dismiss them as stupid because I likewise can be prone to doing the same. And it's a warning about like in what you're talking about just a minute ago, where it's like, be careful about what it is you're giving your attention to. Giving it enough attention will make it your God. It was a warning in many ways, just to be careful about the territory that you're treading. Always stay awake.
Absolutely. And I think the difference between Naughton and Virga, that is a prime example of what you're saying, Zubair. Naughton comes into it with little knowledge. He's unversed in these things. His worldview regarding Messiah figures is very mechanical and academic, and he's just going there to write a book. Virga understands that there's more, or at least understands more quickly than Naughton.
He saw what happened to Naughton, and that gave him a greater awareness of like that he needs to tread carefully.
And Michael there knows Baal from long ago, so he even has more knowledge than Virga, and even warns Virga. Yeah, and I'm paraphrasing, but if you're coming with me, there's certain things you're going to see and experience that should give you pause. You have to be careful. Again, paraphrasing Michael's words, but essentially that. Be careful of what you expose yourself to, whether it's a concept, whether it's your own past that you can't shake off, or whether it's religious and cultic rites.
Oh, boy. Well, that's the episode, folks. Zubair, super grateful that you took the time to do some research, read the book with us, and join us on this week's episode.
Thanks for having me. It's always a good time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to whatever book we decide to invite you on to next, if it lines up with your schedule, because I always come out of these episodes learning something that I didn't know and a little bit of a wider view, learn something about Catholicism as well as ancient people groups. So not every time. You're not always talking about ancient people groups. I do feel like I learned something when we chat. So
Indeed. Thanks, Zubair. Always happy to have you on. And audience, thank you for joining us on this episode. Take a moment to go to your favorite podcast platform, wherever you listen to us, and give us a rating and a review that gets us in front of more and more people. One note we should say before we leave you is we're taking a little break, so you won't be hearing from SideQuest Podcast for a few weeks. We are reworking some of the processes and some of the brand to make this a better show for you. And we'll see you soon. Until next time.
what he means by a few weeks is we're taking off until mid-October. That's what he means. Let's just clarify.
Potato.
No, a few weeks is like me and you going on vacation, and then we like miss a couple weeks and we're back at the end of the month. We're taking off till October. Enjoy your summer, folks, and we look forward to showing you the surprises that we prepared when we get back, which will start off with Ghostwater, Book 5 of the Cradle series. And we have quite the surprise for that guest episode, and I can't wait to share it with you.
Don't we ever? We're going to sacrifice a child.
Nope, we're not doing that. I told
Again.
you. Nope, again. We'll see you folks later.